The smell of burning flesh drifted across a Roman courtyard, a smell so thick, so sickly sweet, that even hardened soldiers shifted uncomfortably. The iron griddle glowed red against the open flames, its heat distorting the air into waves of cruel shimmer, and bound to it, naked, blistering, and breaking, was not a criminal, not a rebel, not a foreign enemy, but a deacon of the Christian church. The crowd gathered to watch knew what was expected. Victims screamed. They begged. They clawed at the air for mercy, their humanity stripped bare before death finally silenced them. That was the purpose of Rome's machinery of punishment, to display the futility of resistance, to crush not only the body of the condemned, but the spirit of everyone who watched. But something happened that day in 2558 AD that shattered Rome's theater of terror. The man on the griddle did not scream, he did not curse. He smiled, and as the prefect demanded obedience, as the executioners stoked the fire, he spoke words so unthinkable, so unnervingly calm, that they would echo across centuries. "Turn me over, I am done on this side." This was not madness. This was defiance. And this is the story of how Rome, in trying to destroy one man, instead created a martyr whose death would haunt the empire and expose the true cost of its cruelty. The empire still called itself eternal, but its walls whispered another truth. From the northern forests came shadows of tribes pressing harder each year against fading legions. From the east, whispers of Persia's victories reached Rome like storm winds breaking shutters in the night. Within the city itself, coinage cracked under the weight of false silver, its value shrinking as quickly as the trust of those who held it. And in the silence between temples and forums, something more dangerous than armies was spreading. Faiths that belonged to strangers, gods that had not been born in Rome's soil. The empire smelled of smoke and rot. In the markets, bread was scarce, its cost rising beyond the reach of common hands. Soldiers paid with coins that no longer gleamed. Fathers left fields abandoned to dust because tax collectors stripped them bare before harvest. The air felt unsteady, as if the whole world leaned toward collapse. It was in this unraveling that Emperor Valerian sought control the way drowning men clutch at stone. His reign was not built on majesty, but on fear sharpened into policy. He did not lash out blindly, as earlier rulers had done in moments of panic. He calculated, he measured, he designed cruelty as one might design an aqueduct, precise, deliberate, efficient, and his gaze fixed on those who would not bow. Christians had been a nuisance, an irritation to Roman order. For more than a century, they refused the incense, refused the emperor's image, refused the gods who had bound the empire together for generations. But what had once been a scattered sect had become something heavier, something Rome could no longer ignore. They built networks of charity that reached into alleys the Senate had never seen. They fed the poor when Rome's granaries failed. They buried the forgotten dead in catacombs. No law could enter. They spoke of a kingdom not made with Roman hands, and that Valerian understood was treason wrapped in prayer. So he broke the silence. His edicts did not thunder with the spontaneity of rage. They cut like steel. One ordered the death of bishops and priests, the shearing away of every shepherd so the flock might scatter. Another stripped noble Christians of their estates, grinding their wealth into the treasury of the state. Cemeteries were sealed, holy gatherings outlawed, the very rituals of mourning branded as crimes. Rome called it preservation. In truth, it was dissection, carving faith from the body of the empire before it could spread further. The effect was immediate. The prisons thickened with clergy, their voices echoing psalms against stone walls. Property confiscations left households in ruin, families stripped of names once spoken in marble halls. Executions were no longer the result of local hatred or mob fury, but the deliberate signature of imperial will. Fear began to wear a uniform. Citizens learned to glance over their shoulders when speaking in taverns, to bury their devotion under silence. Others, eager to prove loyalty, betrayed neighbors, friends, Even kin, Rome had turned itself into a stage where faith could be sniffed out like contraband, where cruelty was spectacle and obedience survival. The empire had always wielded fire on battlefields, in arenas, in torches that lined triumphal roads. But now its fire was colder, crueler. It was not the wild blaze of conquest, but the controlled burn of persecution, designed not simply to destroy bodies, but to cauterize belief itself. Valerian believed he was saving Rome. What he built instead was an empire of fire and fear, where the smoke of sacrifice blurred into the smoke of the poor man's hearth, and no one could tell where loyalty ended and terror began. And in that atmosphere, in that careful machinery of dread, a young deacon named Lawrence would soon be asked to make a choice that Rome could neither imagine nor contain. The boy was born where mountains met the sea, in a land Rome called Hispania, but whose soil still whispered in older tongues. The hills were dry and sharp, their olive groves trembling in the wind, their stones warmed by a sun that bleached bone and bread alike. Lawrence grew there, not in marble halls, but among villages, where faith was carried quietly, where prayers were spoken in shadows as much as in temples. He was not marked by visions, not visited by thunder or flame. His gift was subtler, more dangerous. He could see how threads of human lives tied together, how hunger bent spines, how coin could ease suffering when placed in the right hands. He understood that faith without bread was a hollow promise, and that mercy required structure as much as it required prayer. When the Bishop of Rome looked into his eyes, he did not see a mystic, he saw a steward, a boy with steady hands, a memory like stone, and the rare ability to move between the poor who begged in rags and the nobles who gave with reluctant pride. That gift carried Lawrence across the sea, to a city that swallowed men whole, the capital where power was measured not in kindness, but in obedience, not in devotion, but in gold. Rome wrapped itself in grandeur, but its streets stank of sweat, dung, and dust. Beggars pressed against colonnades where senators debated, temples glittered, while behind them mothers sold their bodies for bread. Lawrence stepped into this city not as a conqueror, not even as a priest, but as a servant of order, the deacon entrusted with the treasury of the church. It was not wealth he counted, but the lives fed by it, orphans clothed, prisoners ransomed, widows given dignity in their grief. Every coin placed into his hand became bread, medicine, or burial shrouds. This was his faith. Not in visions or thrones of light, but in the fragile miracle of keeping the poor alive one day longer. In those early years, he was admired even by those who did not share his God. He spoke softly, his voice calm where others preached with thunder. He carried himself not with arrogance, but with a kind of disarming steadiness. People believed him not because he shouted, but because he did not. To the faithful he was hope, to the hungry he was bread, and to Rome he was something altogether more dangerous, a man who made the powerless strong. Yet within that gift lay the seed of his undoing, for to know the names of the poor was also to know the wealth of the church. To carry the trust of the widows was also to hold the keys of the treasury. He stood at the intersection of mercy and power, and that is the place Rome could never allow a man to stand for long. And so the boy from Hispania, whose only weapon was trust, would one day be stripped of that gentle role and forced onto a stage of cruelty designed to erase everything he was. The silence of Rome was never silence. It was broken by the creak of chains, the whisper of sandals on stone, the distant roar of beasts in their cages. But in the summer of Valerian's decree, another sound entered the streets. The scraping of doors unhinged, the rustle of parchment sealed with imperial wax, the sudden stillness of prayers interrupted mid-breath. It began with an edict, read aloud. Its words cold as steel: the bishops and priests must die. Nobles who clung to the forbidden faith would be stripped, their gold seized, their titles erased, cemeteries sealed, gatherings outlawed, mercy itself outlawed. Rome's cruelty was not left to chance. It had been drafted, signed, and sharpened into law. Men who had once felt safe in the catacombs now found soldiers waiting at the entrances. Families that had sung hymns in whispers now heard fists pounding against their doors. The empire no longer tolerated shadows. It sought them out, dragged them into the light, and burned them away. The church had endured persecution before. The chaos of mobs, the whims of governors, the sudden execution that left no time for farewell. But this was different. This was not a storm of hatred that rose and fell. It was a blade wielded with deliberate precision, designed not to wound but to behead. And at the heart of this blade was Pope Sixtus II. He was not a warrior, not a rebel, but a shepherd who had kept his flock alive through patience and silence. His presence steadied Rome's fragile Christians, but even he could not escape the logic of fear turned into law. On an August morning, while conducting worship in the burial grounds of San Callisto, he was seized. Soldiers descended into the earth like shadows, armed with steel, their torches blinding in the close dark of the catacomb. The worshippers froze. To resist was death. To cry out was death. So silence filled the chamber, broken only by the hiss of oil lamps and the barked orders of Rome. They dragged the Pope and his deacons into the open air. There was no trial worth naming, no mercy worth begging for. By order of the emperor, they were struck down, their blood soaking into the ground meant for the bones of martyrs. Witnesses would later swear that Sixtus, even as the blades fell, called out to his deacon Lawrence, charging him to guard the treasures of the church. A final command, delivered in blood, that would seal Lawrence's fate. The killing was not meant only for those who died. It was meant for those who watched, for those who heard, for those who felt their last fragile layer of protection ripped away. Rome wanted no heroes, only silence. But instead it left a wound so raw that every whisper of it spread like fire. In the days that followed, names vanished. Bishops disappeared from their houses. Priests were dragged from alleys and hidden shrines. Wealthy Christians who had once dined beside senators found their estates confiscated, their children begging for food. The empire had set its teeth not against faceless crowds, but against the very sinews of faith, its leaders, its voices, its keepers of memory. Lawrence was left standing in that void, no longer sheltered by his pope, no longer one deacon among many. He became a marked man. Rome's eyes fixed on him not only as a believer, but as the one who held the keys to what remained. The edicts had been written in ink, but now they were carried out in flesh, and in the growing silence of fear, the stage was being set for the next act of cruelty, one that would burn itself into history, not as a law but as a spectacle. The prefect's summons came not with fury, but with formality. A sealed order, a demand wrapped in ritual, carried the chill of authority more lethal than swords. Lawrence was commanded to appear before Rome's magistrates, not as a criminal, but as a custodian of wealth. He was not asked for prayers or loyalty. He was asked for gold. The empire's logic was simple. The Christians had grown bold, feeding the poor, ransoming prisoners, burying their dead with a dignity denied by law. These things required coin, silver vessels, jeweled chalices, offerings gathered in secret, but known to Rome. Valerian's edict had been clear. Strip the church not only of its leaders, but of its means. Remove the head, then starve the body. The prefect's voice was steady, heavy with assumption. Surrender the treasures, and perhaps mercy might be shown. Refuse, and the flames would speak instead. For 3 days, Lawrence walked the streets of Rome as a man already condemned. He carried no chains, yet every glance from a soldier was a chain. Every echo of footsteps on stone reminded him that time was collapsing, pressing closer with each hour. He used those days not to preserve himself, but to scatter what wealth remained. Coins placed into trembling hands, chalices broken down for bread, silver melted into sustenance. He did not hide the riches. He dissolved them, pouring them into the lives of those Rome despised. But there was one act yet to perform, one gesture that would expose the empire's blindness. When he appeared before the prefect, he did not come alone. Behind him walked the lame, the blind, the widows dressed in threadbare cloth, the orphans with hollow eyes, the sick whose bodies bent under unseen weights. They filled the hall not with splendor, but with the stench of poverty, the shuffle of unsteady feet, the wheeze of failing lungs. The prefect looked, expecting chests of gleaming wealth, and saw instead the broken faces of the forgotten. Lawrence's voice cut through the silence. "These," he said, "are the treasures of the church." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to disperse. In a city where gold was worshipped, where status was measured in marble and silk, Lawrence had inverted the scales. He had declared that Rome's discarded, Rome's diseased and despised were more valuable than all the riches of the empire. It was more than defiance. It was mockery. The prefect, used to groveling, found himself confronted by a man who refused to be small. Lawrence did not kneel. He did not beg. He unveiled Rome's shame, parading it in its own halls, and dared the empire to see truth in the faces it spat upon. The rage that followed was not the anger of insult alone. It was the rage of exposure. Rome had been unmasked, its power ridiculed by a man who owned nothing but faith. And in that unmasking, the prefect's choice was sealed. He could not tolerate the inversion of Rome's order. He could not allow the poor to be called treasure, nor weakness to be exalted as strength. The decision was swift. Lawrence would die, but not by sword, not by swift stroke or hidden dungeon. His death would be engineered as a spectacle, a lesson, a performance of terror. The prefect's humiliation demanded a punishment as inventive as it was cruel. The poor shuffled out of the hall, their role complete, their lives still fragile, but their faces etched into the memory of those who watched. Lawrence remained, calm as a man who had already given away everything he could. His body belonged to Rome now, but his words had already escaped, carried on whispers that no edict could silence. What he had declared could not be unsaid, and so the empire, in its fury, prepared to answer with fire. They chose iron because iron remembers heat. In a yard behind the prefect's residence, where the air smelled of ash and animal fat, men with blackened forearms lifted a lattice of bars from a bed of coals and set it down to cool, then lifted it again, testing, learning, listening to the hiss that meant life would cling longer to pain. The grid was not crude. Each bar was spaced to share the wound, to write its pattern evenly across the body, so that no mercy would be found in distance, no corner left untouched. A scaffold built not for speed but for endurance. A map of suffering hammered into metal. Around them the ritual thickened. Wood was stacked in measured tiers, dry oak first, then resinous kindling that would bloom and settle, then charcoal whose heat did not scream but smoldered, obedient and tireless. Pitch waited in sealed jars, to be brushed along the bars when the fire sank, to awaken the heat without the flare that steals breath too quickly. Buckets of water stood nearby, not for rescue but for control, a thin stream over glowing iron to draw steam and keep a man awake in his burning. Ropes were checked, leather straps cut to hold wrists and ankles where they could not twist free, even when nerves began to sing and fail. Nothing here was improvised. Cruelty in Rome's hands had been learned like a craft. The courtyard itself felt like a mouth holding its breath. Walls on three sides gathered the heat and sent it back. A strip of sky hung above, bright and indifferent, while flies tasted the air and lifted, settled again. Soldiers leaned against stone, their shields stacked in a neat, contemptuous row. Scribes cleaned their reed pens. Witnesses would come. The poor would be kept outside the gate, the respectable placed where they could see and carry the story home. The message was always twofold. The condemned would be unmade before the eyes of the city, and the city would be bound tighter by what it had watched. He had not been brought yet, but already his absence shaped the place. Men speak differently when death is expected. They shorten words, lower laughter, look at their hands as if to ask whether the skin on their knuckles belongs to them. One of the fire tenders rubbed a charm smooth as bone between thumb and forefinger. Another crossed himself quickly, as if spitting out a seed. Fear was not forbidden. It was measured. There had been other instruments. Stakes, hooks, sanded poles that climbed the sky. But the grid was the answer to a specific hunger. Spectators had grown used to the arch of a back stiffening on the cross. The sudden sag when the lungs gave up. The grid promised a different spectacle, a slow writing of agony that unfolded like the day. Heat would rise through iron into flesh, draw blisters like pearls, then crack them, then thicken the air with the sweetness of cooked fat, and ask everyone present to breathe it. The body would not bleed enough to faint. The tongue would not be able to choke on itself. Suffering would be kept lucid, each nerve a lit candle. Rome believed in order. Even its punishments had proportions. The condemned was a lesson, and a lesson must be legible, so the place of binding was swept. The ash raked smooth, the iron raised and lowered, until the right glow held not white, not sullen black, but that living orange that trembles the air and promises patience. A centurion's palm hovered over the bars, withdrew with a curse, nodded. The scribes dipped their pens. Somewhere beyond the wall a hawker cried figs, and the sound slid over stone like a mockery of appetite. When they brought him, the yard changed temperature, not the air that was already hot, but the living heat of attention. Faces lifted, boots scuffed. The man from Hispania walked without iron on his ankles, his wrists unmarked by shackles. Though he had been bound by orders more surely than any chain, his hair lay flat with dust. His robe torn at the hem, a strip of linen wound around one hand where yesterday's rope had burned. He saw the grid and did not look away. That, too, is part of the ceremony. The condemned must meet the instrument, must recognize it as a future they cannot leave. They stripped him quickly, without insult, and that was the deeper insult. No jeers, no theatrical shoves, only the efficient erasure of modesty, the public unthreading of a man's privacy so that he became a surface. The iron waited for skin, the straps tightened, leather bit, and then settled as flesh swelled against it. His breath shortened, not from pain yet, but from the animal knowledge of heat. A muscle in his jaw jumped. Sweat formed, then vanished before it could fall. Rome liked to believe that pain purified its meaning. In truth, pain distorts it. A condemned man becomes all body, all now. Yet this was the psychology the prefect trusted, to draw fear out like silk from a cocoon, strand by strand, until obedience gleamed thin and complete. If the man would recant, if he would point with his eyes toward hidden coin, toward names, toward urns of silver, then the fire could be slowed, the straps loosened, the iron lifted just enough for breath to return like a rumor of rain. Mercy dangled not as gift, but as instrument. The crowd pressed closer against the gate, dignitaries inside doing what dignitaries always do when cruelty is near, learning to pretend it is not about them. They arranged their faces into the mask of necessary sorrow. A few adjusted rings that had grown tight in the heat. One licked cracked lips, as if tasting the future and finding it bitter. Smoke began its soft climbing, gray at first, then darker where pitch kissed iron. The smell gathered, sweet and oily, touching the back of the throat with a finger that would not be removed. He closed his eyes once, not in refusal, but like a man listening for a name. When he opened them, the light was harsher. The first kiss of the bars was not a scream, it was a soundless widening, a tremor that ran the length of his frame and returned. Every place the iron touched became a mouth opening to speak, and finding only heat. The prefect waited for the ritual to find its syllables. The begging, the bargaining, the place where power balances itself on a single breath. He waited because Rome had built a whole faith upon that balance. If a man trembles and asks to live, then authority is confirmed. If he stiffens and goes silent, the audience grows restless. But if he remains lucid, if the mind stands where the flesh is forced to fall, then the lesson wanders and the fire begins to teach the wrong thing. Leather creaked, iron sang. A drop of sweat slid to the corner of his mouth and turned to nothing before he could taste it. Somewhere a child cried and was hushed with a hand and a lie. The day held its breath, and with it a question Rome did not want to hear spoken aloud. The bars glowed, the flesh answered, and the courtyard filled with a waiting that felt like a mirror turned toward every face present, asking what exactly they had come to see, and what, when it arrived, they would do with it. The first breath of burning flesh rolled across the courtyard like incense from a desecrated altar. It clung to the tongue, coated the throat, drew nausea from stomachs that had thought themselves hardened. The grid hissed. Skin seared where it touched iron, blistering, breaking, oozing. Soldiers averted their eyes, not because they pitied him, but because the smell betrayed their own mortality. Death by fire was not spectacle to the senses. It was intimacy forced upon everyone present. The prefect waited for it. The shattering scream that should have broken loose from the deacon's throat, the cry that would confirm Rome's authority. Instead, there was silence, not the silence of collapse, but of control. His jaw clenched, then softened. His lips moved, not in a curse, but in words shaped like prayer. Whispers moved through the crowd. Some thought him mad, his mind dissolved in agony. Others leaned forward, certain they had heard praise carried on the smoke. The condemned was not writhing as he should. His chest rose steady, his eyes still alive, their clarity more terrible than despair. It was not flesh that defied Rome, but the refusal of spirit to bend. The fire was fed again. Coals shifted, pitch brushed against iron, heat swelled until the very air shimmered like water. His back, pressed to the bars, smoked in places, blackened in others, each nerve singing its song of ruin. A man should beg for mercy, should claw at the straps, should empty his soul in terror. Lawrence spoke instead, his voice raw but lucid, a sound not broken but sharpened. "Turn me over," he said, with a trace of something unbearable humor. "This side is done." The words cracked across the courtyard like lightning splitting stone. Not laughter, not mockery alone, but defiance so profound it inverted the ritual. The condemned was instructing his torturers, guiding them as though the execution belonged to him. The prefect's face froze. Soldiers shifted uneasily, caught between obedience and the uncanny sense that they were being ordered by the very man they sought to destroy. The crowd stirred, unsettled. They had come for blood, for screams, for the confirmation that Rome's power reduced men to ash. Instead, they saw composure where there should have been collapse, heard jest where there should have been wailing. Whispers spread like embers. Was it madness? Was it sorcery? Was it proof that this god they despised was stronger than fire? The executioners obeyed. They turned him, laying raw flesh against air, pressing unburned skin to iron, now hungry for more. The straps creaked, his body arched, and still his lips moved. More words. Some claimed he prayed for his captors, others swore he asked for the conversion of Rome. Scribes wrote what they could, their pens trembling as though the ink itself rebelled against the empire's script. Every second stretched, drawn taut by the dissonance between what Rome demanded and what unfolded before their eyes. Torture was meant to unravel men, to make them animals stripped of dignity, to display power as absolute. But here the grid itself seemed to falter, not because it failed in cruelty, but because its cruelty was met with unshaken clarity. The iron burned flesh, but could not scorch away meaning. The prefect clenched his jaw, furious. This was supposed to be mastery, not theater for a rebel's courage. Yet the fire betrayed him. Each lash of flame carried not Rome's dominance but Lawrence's defiance. The longer the body endured, the greater the inversion became. The punishment had become proclamation. The empire mocked by a man whose voice would not be silenced. The smell thickened until it forced tears from the eyes of those who watched. Some wept in secret, not from pity but from the unbearable weight of what they had seen. For in the fire they glimpsed not Rome's strength, but Rome's weakness, its inability to conquer the one thing it sought to erase, conviction. And when his voice faded, it did not collapse into screams, but into thanksgiving. His last words were not surrender, but offering. The man roasted on the gridiron died not as victim, but as witness. The prefect turned away. Soldiers loosened straps that no longer resisted, but the silence that followed was more dangerous than any cry, for in that silence lived the echo of his smile, the echo of his words, a smile Rome could not kill, a phrase it could not unsay. At first, the crowd had come as they always did, with the hunger of spectators. They expected noise, the tearing of flesh, the collapse of faith into pleading. They had seen criminals mauled by beasts, rebels broken on crosses, thieves strangled with ropes, until their eyes bulged and their bowels gave way. They thought they knew the script, the rhythm of terror, as entertainment. But as the fire consumed him, silence spread like a shadow across the assembly. Mothers who had pressed forward to glimpse blood now drew their children back. Men who had once laughed at executions found their throats dry, their tongues heavy, for what stood before them was not the collapse of a man, but his refusal to collapse at all. Whispers rose, uncertain, like the first rustle of leaves before a storm. Some muttered that sorcery preserved him, others that the Christian god had stepped into the courtyard unseen. A few spoke of omens, of Rome itself being mocked before its own eyes. And yet the most disturbing thought was the one no one dared to voice aloud, that the empire, for all its fire, for all its cruelty, might not have the power it claimed. The air thickened with smoke, with the sickly sweetness of burning, and yet in that stench, faith did not die. It spread. Those who should have been horrified found themselves unsettled by admiration. If this man could smile while iron devoured his flesh, what could Rome do to anyone? What could Rome do to you? The soldiers felt it too. They shifted their weight, tightened grips on their spears, glanced at one another with the unease of men who feared not their enemy, but the thought growing inside their own heads. Torture was supposed to strip dignity, not crown it. Yet Lawrence, bound and burning, seemed larger than his executioners, larger even than the prefect who had ordered it. And the prefect himself knew it. His jaw hardened, his lips pressed thin, his authority corroded by each heartbeat that passed without the expected screams. Every second Lawrence endured was another crack in the illusion of Roman invincibility. The crowd no longer looked at the empire with awe. They looked at a dying man, and their awe turned elsewhere. The murmurs became a trembling, a restlessness that shivered through the assembly like a current of cold air. Some spectators averted their gaze, unable to endure what they had once craved. Others leaned forward with eyes shining not with cruelty but with something far more dangerous, reverence. The empire had staged a spectacle of dominance, but the audience was no longer watching Rome. They were watching the man in flames and finding in him something the empire could not give: courage, unbroken, faith unburned. When he finally grew still, the silence was deeper than before, heavy as stone, suffocating in its weight. And in that silence, the crowd trembled. Not from pity, not from grief, but from the unbearable recognition that they had seen something Rome could not control. When the straps were loosened at last, his body no longer resisted. Charred flesh clung to the iron, torn away like wax from a candle. His limbs sagged with the heaviness of ruin. Yet his face did not bear the mask Rome had prepared for him. There was no twisted snarl of pain, no slackened mouth of despair. What remained was stillness, not the stillness of defeat, but of completion. He had not given them what they wanted. He had not begged, not cursed, not surrendered a single name or secret. Even in his final breaths he spoke not of gold nor of Rome, but of thanksgiving, words that rose fragile as smoke, carrying prayers for those who killed him, prayers for a city that had chosen to consume him like meat over fire. He was supposed to vanish into ash, but instead he left behind an image carved deeper than any monument, a man who died smiling in flames. The prefect tried to dismiss it. He gestured coldly for the body to be dragged away, for the crowd to disperse, for life to return to its familiar rhythm of obedience. But the rhythm was broken. Those who had witnessed the burning carried something Rome had not accounted for. They had seen fire fail. They had seen torture become testimony. They had seen a man turned into a vessel of defiance greater than any sword. The empire could end his life, but it could not end what he had shown. In dying, he had inverted the order of power. Rome had placed him on the gridiron to display the futility of resistance. Instead, resistance became immortal. His silence between words, his calm amid smoke, his bitter jest that mocked the fire. These things survived him. They spread not through parchment, but through the memory of eyes that had watched and ears that had heard. For the Christians who had trembled under Valerian's decrees, his death did not extinguish hope, it ignited it. The community, leaderless, stripped of wealth, pressed to the brink of erasure, now had an example carved in fire, a martyr who would not break, whose very suffering had become a weapon sharper than Rome's cruelty. They whispered his name in underground chambers, in dark alleys, at graves left unmarked. Every whisper grew into defiance. If Lawrence could endure the flames with prayer on his lips, what chains, what prisons, what crosses could silence the faith of others? The prefect did not know it, but the very moment he thought he had destroyed a man, he had created something far more dangerous, a symbol. Symbols cannot bleed. Symbols do not rot. Symbols do not tremble under threat. They live in memory, multiplying long after flesh has fallen into dust. Lawrence's body was ruined, his skin blackened, his chest still. But what Rome had failed to burn was the truth that a man, even when stripped of all things, could still choose how to die. That choice, calm, smiling, defiant, carried more weight than the empire's fire. And so the man who should have been forgotten with the smoke was instead etched into history, not as a victim but as a martyr who would not break. Rome believed that cruelty erased memory, that fire, when hot enough, did not just burn flesh but also burned away the thought of resistance. Yet in the days after Lawrence's death, the empire found itself stalked, not by silence but by whispers it could not control. The city still smelled of smoke. It lingered in courtyards, in tunics, in hair. Those who had been there could not wash it away. They carried it into taverns, into marketplaces, into the hush of their own homes, and with the smell came the memory of what they had seen. A man who mocked his executioners while his body cracked and bled upon iron. Valerian had wanted terror. What spread instead was unease. Something had gone wrong with the ritual of power. The prefect had unveiled the empire's cruelty with pride, but the people left asking questions they had no language to answer. How could a man smile when fire devoured him? How could suffering sound like victory? And if the empire could not break him, could it truly break anyone? The Christians, once cowed, found themselves walking differently. They did not boast, but they no longer bent their heads quite as low. They whispered Lawrence's words in the dark, letting them echo like psalms in forbidden gatherings. His death became not a warning, but a call. Even among Rome's faithful citizens, doubts crept in like cold air beneath a door. Soldiers who had stoked the fire avoided one another's eyes. Scribes who had recorded his words found their hands trembling when they lifted their pens again. The prefect himself felt it most of all. Authority had demanded obedience. Yet the crowd had gone home murmuring not about Rome's strength, but about the man it had killed. And in this dissonance, the empire was haunted. Haunted not by the corpse dragged away, but by the memory of composure stronger than steel. Haunted by the knowledge that cruelty, so carefully engineered, had faltered at the edge of a man's smile. Persecution tightened, as it always did when authority sensed its grip slipping. More executions followed, more property seized, more prayers driven underground. But the harder Rome clenched its fist, the more the story slipped through its fingers. Lawrence's name moved from lip to lip, carried by the poor he had called treasure, carried by strangers who had only smelled the smoke. It was no longer simply about a man. It was about Rome itself, the empire that claimed it could master death, yet found itself mocked by a dying deacon. The power of law, of armies, of fire had been revealed as fragile against conviction, and fragility, once seen, cannot be unseen. So Rome carried on, but beneath its marble and iron a shadow grew. The shadow of a martyr who would not break, a ghost whose smile lived longer than fire. The empire had tried to kill faith with heat and iron. Instead, it had fed it. The fire had consumed his flesh, but it could not consume the meaning of his death. In the nights that followed, when lamps burned low and silence pressed against the walls of hidden rooms, his name was spoken with the weight of prayer. Lawrence, the deacon who mocked the flames, the man who smiled while Rome tried to unmake him. His story passed from mouth to mouth like contraband, carried in whispers as though even sound itself might be hunted. And yet it spread, faster than soldiers could march, deeper than edicts could reach. Rome believed victory lived in ash, that a body broken was a lesson finished. But what lingered was not the charred ruin of his skin, it was the vision of composure, the unbearable inversion of power, that a man bound and burning had commanded the moment more fully than the empire that killed him. The gridiron had been designed to erase dignity. Instead, it had carved dignity into the memory of all who watched. For the Christians, his death was a banner raised higher than any Roman eagle. He had taken Rome's theater of fear and turned it into testimony. The poor he had called treasures now carried his defiance as their inheritance. Widows who had once wept in secrecy found courage in his smile. Children too young to understand fire learned that faith could outlast iron. His martyrdom became a seed, and from it grew the unshakable belief that no empire, however vast, could extinguish conviction. Even those outside the faith were not left untouched. Merchants remembered the silence of the crowd, soldiers remembered the steadiness of his voice, and whispers of the Christian God began to mingle with Roman doubt. If one man could face the flames and speak as though they were powerless, then perhaps Rome itself was not eternal. Perhaps its fire was weaker than it believed. Valerian's persecution continued, sharpened, desperate. But every blow fell against a people now tempered by the example of Lawrence. The gridiron meant to terrify, instead fortified them. Rome's cruelty, meant to erase, had become the stone upon which memory was carved. His death was not a conclusion, it was an ignition. And across decades, across generations, the story survived. It traveled in hymns, sung softly in catacombs, in painted icons hidden behind walls, in the trembling recollections of those who had smelled the smoke with their own lungs. Long after the prefect was dust, long after Valerian himself was captured and chained by foreign hands, Lawrence's name lived, not as victim, but as conqueror. The flames that devoured him became the very symbol of a faith Rome could not kill. Fire no longer belonged only to the empire. It belonged to the martyr, whose burning became illumination. His defiance became scripture without parchment. His death a sermon no power could censor. 17 centuries have passed, and still his story burns, not in the grates of Roman courtyards, but in the memory of every injustice endured, in the whisper of every soul who refuses to bow. His life was taken, but his meaning was not. That is why his flame endures, not as smoke, not as ash, but as a fire Rome itself could not control. And so Lawrence, the deacon from Hispania, became what the empire feared most. Not a man who died, but a man whose death could never be silenced. A man whose flames did not die.